What historical fact does no one like to talk about? During the Battle of Waterloo, one of the most treasured pieces of loot was the teeth of the deceased soldiers 200 years ago. It was rather common to use the teeth of dead people in the creation of dentures. The Second Congo War. This was the deadliest conflict since World War II, with over 5 million people killed. Most people have never heard of it despite it ending less than 20 years ago. Between the 1930s and the 1970s, about 1/3 of the female population of Puerto Rico was sterilized. The reason Egyptian mummies are so rare is because we used to eat them or turn them into medicine. During the Nuremberg trials post-WWII, head of the Nazi Navy and head of state after Hitler's death, Karol Donitz, was charged with war crimes involving his use of unrestricted submarine warfare and killing of unarmed civilian ships. Donitz provided evidence that nearly all the ships he attacked were in fact armed with anti-submarine weapons and radios, and also a large amount of evidence that the United States committed the exact same war crimes against the Japanese. Due to this, those charges were dropped, and he served only 10 years in prison before being set free. 20 to 30 million people died because a Chinese guy proclaimed himself the brother of Jesus Christ. 45 BC was the longest year in history with 445 days. Psychological experiments were often highly unethical historically. Experiments with children were particularly cruel a lot of the time. The history of the West Virginia coal miners and the Civil War that it brought about. The Rif is the area of Morocco with the highest rate of cancer patients. Research shows that 80% of adults and 50% of children with cancer in Morocco are from the area that the Spanish Air Force repeatedly bombed with mustard gas and other chemical weapons in order to quell Berber fighters during the independence struggle from 1921 to 1927. Spain still refuses to issue an apology for this war crime, despite having signed the Geneva Convention, when they use these weapons on Moroccans. In the early 1900s, before WWII, over 30 states in the US had laws allowing the forced sterilization of immigrants, minorities and the disabled. Hitler would later comment on how some of his laws were inspired by these states. Just look up eugenics in the US. Over 100 women in California prisons were forcefully sterilized between 2006 to 2010. That was only 12 years ago. That the siege and sacking of Tenochtitlan was done almost explicitly by neighboring tribes who hated Aztecs for the blatant crimes against humanity that they pursued on a regular basis. Kidnappings, human sacrifice, etc. Spanish accounts of the sacking of the city are unbelievably graphic. Edit. The entirety of Cortez and his conquistadors is a particularly interesting bit of history. My favorite fact in particular is this. Cortez wasn't even supposed to go to the New World in the first place. A relative of his was supposed to go, but had prior engagements. He sent Cortez with a handful of men and horses and the explicit order to not do anything crazy. One of the biggest proponents for prohibition were suffragettes who found a correlation between alcohol consumption and domestic violence. I'm Italian. We love to call ourselves victims of Nazi Germany, but we invented fascism and we first bombed civilians with gas. In Libya, 1911-12, we invaded Ethiopia, slaughtering and raping, politically killing the League of Nations. We sucked and we suck like all the people in the world. While we love to say Italiani brava gente, Italians are good people. Edit. When I say we sucked and suck, I meant we are not special, like nobody is. In the right condition, in the wrong situation, everyone can start ethnic cleaning someone else. Gandhi used to sleep naked with young girls in the same bed. He did it to test his chastity or something along those lines. Marcus Lucullus Crassus invented, revived, decimation after a series of lost battles. He had every 10th soldier of his legions killed in order to boost the morale of the others. It worked. King Leopold II of Belgium was an all-around awful person, and what he got up to in Africa is not for the faint of heart or weak of stomach. Here's one. The Nazis were one of, if not the first major government to strictly impose animal protection laws. MK Ultra. Only conspiracists care anymore. Most Americans don't know what it was. A brief explanation for those who don't know, MK Ultra was a top-secret CIA project in which the agency conducted hundreds of clandestine experiments, sometimes on unwitting US citizens, to assess the potential use of LSD and other drugs for mind control, information gathering and psychological torture. Though Project MK Ultra lasted from 1953 until about 1973, details of the illicit program didn't become public until 1975, during a congressional investigation into widespread illegal CIA activities within the United States and around the world. The last Englishman arrested for being gay was in the year 1999. He was in the army, and it was still a crime to be gay in the army. The FBI's COINTELPRO program to attack the civil rights movement. That George Washington basically started the French and Indian War, which directly led to the creation of the United States as an independent nation. Nanking. That's a bad one. Unit 731. I think the Japanese government still refuses to acknowledge that this happened, or at least skirts around it, and it makes me fucking sick. During the 1820s and beyond, freed African American slaves colonized Liberia, where they enslaved and sold the indigenous people of Liberia to slave traders from the United States and throughout Europe. Japan treated Okinawans worse than the Americans did, and they were willing to lose the lives of up to 28 million civilians. The pictures of the emaciated Boer women and children from the Brit concentration camps in Say are god awful. That doing laundry was hard, dull work. Very little glamour, not hugely interesting. It was smelly, and the women that did it were often unfairly depicted as whores, because it was some of the best money they could make. Thank God for washing machines now. In the Stone Age, when people would kill a bear, the first thing they'd do is rip open its stomach to eat the meal the bear had consumed before being killed. Japanese war crimes. For some reason barely anyone speaks about them. That Tibet under the Dalai Lamas was a pretty brutal theocracy with a medieval criminal code. They still punished theft by chopping off hands. Also in the 1930s, they made 2 attempts to expand south into Chinese territory, though granted Great Britain was financially involved. Note, none of this excuses the Chinese invasion, but there is a tendency to see Tibet through rose-colored glasses these days. Cambodia and Pol Pot. It seems there are very few people that know who this guy is so recently too. For Americans at least, the Dole Fruit Company was basically responsible for more overthrown government than the CIA or KGB. Think about that next time you're eating some pineapples or bananas. A lot of Americans were pro-Hitler in WW2. At the top, several answers will all be things that people do like to talk about, hence their position in the ranking. The US has a history of forced sterilization on minority women, primarily Native American and Black. Edit. I'd like to add Hispanic, poor and mentally ill to the list. I didn't mean to exclude them. I just hadn't personally read up on them and didn't want to put incorrect info out there. The entry hole in the rear of JFK's head was measured by Dr. Pierre Fink, the only ballistics expert of any note whatsoever to examine his remains, as smaller than the caliber of bullet Lee Harvey Oswald was supposed to have fired. There are quite a few events that the US government have facilitated to our very own citizens throughout history that, after many years of denying, have finally confirmed what were considered conspiracy theories. Examples: Project Nkultra, Watergate, Gulf of Tonkin, etc. The CIA, FBI, NSA have the ability to create elaborate cover-ups, and there is nothing we can do about. What's interesting is that, after denying certain events, they then admit to it, but by that time no one cares, and they get a free pass yet again. Edward Bernays, Sigmund Freud's nephew, Jewish immigrant in the US in the early 1910s, basically the architect of modern day capitalism and propaganda, media, advertising, etc., using his uncle's psychoanalysis studies as its foundation. Joseph Goebbels picked up the book, Crystallizing Public Opinion by Edward Bernays, and used it to create effective Nazi propaganda that basically catapulted them into power. TLDR, a man of Jewish heritage wrote the propaganda playbook that the Nazis used to create the Holocaust. We use the research gained from Nazi experiments to further medical science,